following is an interview in the Southern California home of a biologist whose company is fundraising an effort to construct, test, and distribute a DIY coronavirus vaccine out of synthetic DNA. Reason granted his request for anonymity due to fear of retribution from the FDA, but has verified his identity, that of his business partner, and of a potential Silicon Valley funder. The proposal under discussion and contact information is available in a link below this video.
I'm a biologist. I've been working in the field for about 10 years, molecular biology, biochemistry, mostly in industry, making proteins, making DNA, all the kind of things that people want to pay you to make. And I've also been involved in the DIY bio community since near its inception.
By DIY bio community, he means a grassroots movement comprised of professionals and amateur biologists who experiment with genetic engineering in their homes and community labs. People like Josiah Zahner, founder of the Odin, which distributes kits allowing anyone to experiment with CRISPR, a gene editing tool. Members of this community have created glowing yeast by inserting jellyfish genes, injected themselves with homemade vaccines, attempted to reverse engineer patented pharmaceuticals, and tried to genetically engineer dogs.
The FDA, despite people's usual perception of them as fairly friendly, I mean, they are looking out for the consumer, but if someone is trying to develop and distribute an unapproved medicine, they will come down hard, and they have. And for someone like me that doesn't have lawyers on retainer, and for our group in general, it's a severe risk to our livelihoods outside of this project if we were to be de-anonymized.
So you've put together this proposal in a document titled Coronope. Could you give us an overview of what's in that document and what your proposal is?
It's a brief outline of how vaccines are made, how DIY vaccines could be made, since so far no one has really had to DIY a vaccine, and kind of a brief scientific and technical background on how it would be designed, and then how we would go about manufacturing it and distributing it.
Why do you see the need for this? What is the purpose of a DIY vaccine at this point?
In a pandemic situation, obviously there's a bit more leniency on the part of the FDA and various other regulators to push things through as fast as possible. But especially after the swine flu vaccine scandal, where the vaccine was developed, rushed through, and distributed, and then a few hundred people, at least in the US, developed a very rare neurological disorder. Since that time, they've not taken too many more liberties, even during pandemics. Companies that are developing vaccines nowadays, they have to go through several months of testing, and then final approval, and then watching out for side effects. And we feel that there might be a niche there, at least for us.
You need at least 3 to 4 months to determine if it's safe and whether it induces the kind of response that you would predict would be protective.
Experts like Anthony Fauci, director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, have said a vaccine will likely not be available to the public for about 18 months, even with a fast-track testing process.
With the method that we're using, it's very minimal risk in terms of the patient's safety. There is much more of a risk that it simply won't work, but we prefer to err on the side of it not working rather than it potentially harming people.
The standard methods for creating vaccines are combining a sample of a virus with a less infectious variant, or inactivating the virus with heat or chemicals and allowing it to propagate immunity throughout the body. His team is attempting to create a vaccine using synthetic DNA constructed in a lab, which could save both money and time, though it might require a special device to deliver an electrical pulse to help the vaccine penetrate cell membranes. There are no vaccines on the market created this way, but the pharmaceutical company Inovio is pursuing the same approach, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has expressed interest in funding projects that use this method. How confident are you something like that could actually work, given that there's nothing on the market like that at this point?
The company that we're, shall we say, cribbing the most off of, they have a phase 1, phase 2 clinical trial using basically the exact same approach for MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. They found that they got significant antibody responses in these clinical trials. Now, obviously, they can't test it in an epidemic or pandemic scenario. They would have to actively infect people with this virus. So for now, that's as close as they can get to approval. It's quite promising. It seems that having an antibody response against the particular protein that we're targeting, the spike protein, is enough to neutralize it for most coronaviruses.
What exactly is the path that you would see this taking? How would it be distributed? How would people get their hands on it?
Well, there would be two separate stages. At the first point, we have maybe a few hundred or a few thousand doses that we can distribute to people and they would go ahead and do the injection, monitor themselves, and then after a few weeks or months, ideally we could test their antibody titers against the virus, and at that point it would be considered as close to tested as we can get. I don't think we'll have the stage where we're doing a double-blinded, placebo-controlled trial for this. That's not in our budget and not really in the timeline.
I'm still trying to grasp how this would be distributed. Is this like a Dallas Buyers Club situation where people are, going to their local community lab and collecting a bunch of needles, or is this like online black markets? How would an unapproved vaccine like this even get out into the world?
Yeah, it's a complicated question because if you're not selling it, which we don't plan to, then it becomes less clear. It's not quite self-experimentation, but if you have tens of thousands of people injecting this thing, you can't claim that they are all just self-experimenting. If it does end up needing an electroporation device, yes, it would be centered around community labs. The plasmid itself can be shipped dry to wherever it's needed and reconstituted quite easily. So that side of it isn't quite as difficult, but I don't see us going with some sort of dark web, black market distribution stuff. I don't know if we could make data reporting a precondition of getting a dose in lieu of payment, something like that. But I think people hopefully will understand that it is still experimental, which means we're doing an experiment. So they will become, in a way, guinea pigs, which sounds a little bad, but we'll be guinea pigs as well. So at least we'll all be in the same boat.
And what makes you believe that anybody would inject an untested vaccine?
Well, people inject black tar heroin every day, and I don't think they have quite as much quality control data available as we'll have. But all joking aside, we can provide as much data as we can generate. It's up to people to be able to give their, as it were, informed consent about these things. We appreciate that most people aren't biologists. Ideally, we could get some biologists who are okay with staking their reputation at least a little on saying, yes, this test data looks correct. Having been in the DIY bio community where people will inject plasmids into themselves on a dare or after a couple of drinks, maybe it seems a little less crazy, but at a certain point, not doing something that seems pretty safe in the face of a disease that could kill you or loved ones, it depends on where everyone's particular risk threshold is, I think. And I don't blame them for waiting for an FDA-approved vaccine.
Do you worry that you could make things worse by if you release a vaccine that hasn't gone through the official process and then it does end up injuring people, that then that's going to just create more distrust in the approved vaccine when it eventually comes out?
The other advantage of DNA vaccines, aside from not having to work with live virus, is really at worst they just do nothing. They're extremely well tolerated. That's the one thing we have learned from all the previous clinical trials and various papers over the years, is that the worst you get is a minor rash at the injection site. I think our biggest risk is something that would be true for any vaccine that's developed sometimes. Having antibodies against a virus can do more harm than good.
What is the scenario that you're imagining where this actually would be useful and fill in gaps?
The company developing a vaccine that we're currently closest to in terms of methodology, they'll be spending the next at least 4, probably 6 to 8 months doing their testing. Once they get initial confirmation that it's at least safe, but possibly before manufacturing can scale up, we will have at least some manufacturing capacity. And depending on the level of the pandemic at that time, there might be situations where they're only handing out vaccine to going by like last name, or depending on how much money you have, or first world countries. All these could be preferential distributions that leave plenty of people underserved, and even if it's only a matter of weeks or months before they would get access to the vaccine, those can be life or death. I know it seems like with Italy completely on lockdown, it's nearing maturity, but it's still very early stages, especially in the US. I would say it's a safe bet that this is the worst since the 1918 Spanish flu. I don't think it'll be nearly as bad as that, but I think we'll quickly see that hospitals are very often operating at or near capacity, even without a pandemic on the loose. And especially considering the amount of oxygenation, ventilation that's being needed, you're going to see a lot of people start being triaged, and then the medical services get overwhelmed.
The biohacker was critical of the CDC's failure to facilitate early testing and said the slowness with which the World Health Organization declared coronavirus a pandemic has left most of the world playing catch-up, increasing the odds that an unofficial vaccine might play a role.
The people who are on the ground in these organizations, they mean well, but governments have to, as they say, make number go up with the economy, and even if that means putting people's lives at risk.
So I've gotten verification from one Silicon Valley investor that he is interested in supporting your project. What level of interest have you gotten so far, and what do you need to actually proceed at this point?
One of the advantages of a DNA vaccine is that, unlike with a regular inactivated attenuated virus where you're injecting it into chicken eggs and waiting for these cells to grow, mammalian cells or avian cells divide once every roughly 24 hours, whereas a bacterial cell divides every 20 minutes. So when you look at exponential growth, you can get a lot more bacteria. I would say with $25,000 to $50,000, we could set up a solid bioreactor, a solid purification setup, all the chemicals and plasticware and testing kits that we would need to get a few thousand doses. And from there, it's very much an economy of scale. You can produce 20 times more bacteria for definitely not 20 times the price.
How hopeful are you that you can actually succeed in this endeavor?
I mean, at the most basic level, we can get the plasmid synthesized, which all told will probably be a few $1,000s. In terms of avoiding getting shut down by the FDA or any other regulatory agencies, who knows? We'll see. Whether or not the vaccine itself works, definitely less than 50% chance. We don't want to get anyone's hopes up. If they're putting this in, they're not going to be going out the next day or even 6 months after and believing they have immunity.
Anyone who sees this who's interested in either following what you're doing or helping in some way, what are ways that they can do that?
We have a Bitcoin address. If you send us an email, get in touch with us, we can forward that on to you for the funding side. Otherwise, if you want to weigh in on the technical aspects, or even the regulatory aspects or societal aspects, any of that, please do feel free to get in touch with us. If you're interested in joining our team, again, if we do end up scaling up, getting enough funding for that, we would need skilled hands.
Do you think that what you're doing is going to become more common in the future? Not necessarily for vaccines, but people's ability to kind of develop DIY medications or gene therapies? Like, where do you see the future of that going?
Frankly, I thought we would be there by now. This was not the future I was promised, but sometimes you just gotta make that future, I suppose.